Now let's take a look at how to create basic polygonal objects. Now typically when we model in Maya, we start with a basic polygon primitive, which would be something like a sphere or cube or cylinder, and then we shape that into a more complex object. So we create objects in Maya in one of two ways. We can use the Create menu, and under this we can create NURBS primitives, polygon primitives, as well as other things such as volumes, lights, cameras, and so on. Now I'm going to go over to polygon primitives here, and in fact I'm going to go ahead and click on this dotted line and tear off this menu so we can just see it here in the viewport. Now, in addition to this Create menu, we also can use the shelves that Maya provides. And if we click on the Polygon shelf, you'll see that we have a number of these preset primitives here as well. But let's just go ahead down the list and see how some of these primitives work. Now, the first one in the list, and probably the easiest one to create, is the sphere. Now, the easiest way to create a sphere is just to click on the menu option, and then just left click and drag in Maya. And there we have a sphere. Now, if you want to modify that sphere, you can select it and modify it in either the attribute editor or the channel box. But before we do that, we can also modify things as we create them. And this is important for Maya, so I want you to understand this concept. Most menu options in Maya have this little box off to the right. In fact, you can see here, we've got a lot of these menu options that have these little boxes to the right. And these bring up a menu that control the creation parameters of that object. So if I click on this, you'll see that I have a tool settings menu that comes up, and then I can change my creation parameters. I can change the default radius if I single click. So if I were to just click and not drag, I would get a 1 unit sphere here. But let's go back to this. So I can change my default radius. I can change the number of divisions, so how much detail that sphere has, as well as other parameters depending upon the type of object that you have. But again, I'm going to leave these at default, and let's go ahead and just create another sphere. So I'm going to go ahead and create polygon sphere and drag it out. So now that I have this sphere, I can actually go back and change my values that created it. So I can do that either in the attribute editor or the channel box. So if I click on the attribute editor, you'll see I have a number of tabs for this. I have my main node, which has my translation for it. I have my shape node, but then the third tab should be a poly sphere node. And this is the creation parameters for my sphere. So if you scroll down, you'll see, oh, hey, here's my radius, and I can dial that up and down. These are the number of subdivisions. So if I want fewer subdivisions or more subdivisions, I can dial that in. Now I can also get to these through the channel box. So if I go over to my channel box and scroll down, you'll see I have this little thing here called inputs. If I click on Polysphere 1, which is the same name that was in the attribute editor, you see I have all these same parameters. So I can, again, change my radius. I can type in a number, say 6, or I can highlight the name and middle click and drag in the viewport, just like I do with translation or rotation, and I can change it. If I want to change the number of subdivisions, I can highlight one or more of these, and again, dial these up or down. And I find this to be a very easy way to change my parameters for my objects. So probably the easiest way to do this is to basically just create your object and then dial in your parameters. I find that to be more intuitive. Now I'm going to go ahead and hit my delete key and delete this, and let's go through some of the other objects here. Now the second object is probably one of the more important ones, and that's the cube. And basically it's a two-step process. You left click and drag to set the base, and then left click and drag again to set the height. Now again, if we go into our attribute editor, you'll see we have a polycube node. And again, we can change the parameters for height, width, and depth, as well as a number of subdivisions. And we can do the same in the channel box. So if I go into my inputs, polycube 1, I can again change my number of subdivisions or the size of my box. Next one is cylinder. So one of the nice things about cylinder is that we can also use it to create capsule shapes. So if I go over to my attribute editor and select Phaly Cylinder 1, you can see I've got a number of parameters, the initial radius and the height, as well as a number of subdivisions, including subdivisions for the height and subdivisions for the cap. So if I dial this up a little bit, I can also click on what's called round cap. And that'll actually turn this into a capsule shape. So that's kind of a nice handy thing to have. The cone is actually fairly similar. It's basically you left click and drag out the radius and drag up the height. And again, if we look at the attribute editor, we also have another round cap. So if I give it a few subdivisions in the cap, I can actually make my cone into something resembling an ice cream cone. Then we have a few others here. The plane, well, that's just a simple plane. And we can certainly add subdivisions for height and width. And a few others. We have a torus. So basically for the torus, we drag out the width of the donut. And then the second operation, we change the thickness. Okay, and again, these are shown in the attribute editor, radius and section radius, as well as subdivisions. And then a few others that are kind of really handy. One is called a pipe. So we drag out the radius, drag up the height, just like a cylinder, and then the third click is for the thickness of that. And each one of these, again, we can change our subdivisions. And one of the nice things about this is we can also put a round cap on this so you can kind of give more of a tube shape to that, which is kind of neat. And then a couple of other really interesting ones. The one I like the most is a helix. So basically we drag out the radius, the height, and then the third drag is number of turns. That's a great way to make things such as springs and so on. Now there's a lot of other polygon primitives, and I'm sure you can figure these out. These are all very, very simple, but they make really great bases from which to sculpt more complex objects. So go ahead and play with some of these primitives, play with the creation parameters, go into the channel box and attribute editor to manipulate these after you create them as well. And you'll pretty soon get the hang of how to create objects in Maya.